Would you like to have dinner with us? The millionaire CEO whispered to a poor 7-year-old girl shivering in the freezing cold. Before we dive in, this video is traveling across time zones right now. Share what season you're experiencing where you live. The snow fell like frozen tears across downtown Chicago, blanketing the city in a merciless white that seemed to steal every last bit of warmth from the December air. David Mitchell pulled his cashmere coat tighter as he stepped out of his black Mercedes, the heated leather seats already a distant memory against the brutal cold. At 52, he'd built Mitchell Technologies from nothing into a billion-dollar empire, but tonight, walking toward his favorite steakhouse, he felt every one of those hard-fought years weighing on his shoulders. That's when he saw her. A tiny figure huddled against the brick wall of Santori's restaurant, so small she almost disappeared into the shadows. 7-year-old Emma Carter sat with her knees pulled tight to her chest, her thin jacket doing nothing against the wind that cut through the alley like a knife. Her brown hair whipped around her face, and her lips had turned a frightening shade of blue. She wasn't begging, wasn't asking for anything, just trying to survive the night that threatened to swallow her whole. David stopped dead in his tracks. Something about her reminded him of. No, he pushed that thought away, the one that always came with a stab of pain so sharp it nearly brought him to his knees, but he couldn't walk past her. Not tonight. Not when she looked so much like, "Hey there, sweetheart," he said softly, crouching down to her level. His breath created clouds in the frigid air. "You must be freezing." Emma looked up with eyes that held too much sadness for someone so young. "I'm okay, mister," she whispered. But her voice shook with cold and something deeper, a loneliness that David recognized all too well. "What's your name, honey?" "Emma. Emma Carter." She tried to smile, but her teeth chattered uncontrollably. David's heart clenched. "Emma, that's a beautiful name. I'm David." He looked around the empty street, then back at this child who shouldn't be alone in such brutal weather. "Where's your mom?" She's working," Emma said quietly, pulling her jacket tighter. "She told me to wait here until she gets back." But David could see the fear in her eyes, the uncertainty that suggested her mother might not be coming back anytime soon, or at all. His mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. This little girl needed help, and she needed it now. "Emma," he said gently, his voice carrying a warmth that surprised even him, "you want to come have dinner with me? It's warm inside, and they make the best hot chocolate in Chicago." Emma hesitated, looking up at this tall stranger in his expensive coat. "Mom says I shouldn't talk to strangers." "Your mom is very smart," David agreed. "But sweetheart, you're going to freeze out here, and I promise I just want to help. You can call your mom from inside, okay?" For a moment, Emma just stared at him. Then slowly she nodded. David helped her to her feet, feeling how cold her little hands were, even through her thin gloves. As they walked toward the warm glow of the restaurant, he had no idea that this moment would change everything, for both of them. The warmth of Santori's restaurant hit them like a wall, and David watched as Emma's shoulders finally relaxed for the first time since he'd found her. The maitre d', Antonio, greeted David with his usual warm smile, but his eyes widened when he saw the shivering child beside Chicago's most powerful CEO. "Mr. Mitchell, your usual table?" "Please, Antonio. And bring us some hot chocolate for the young lady right away." As they settled into the leather booth, David couldn't help but notice how Emma's eyes grew wide at the crystal chandeliers, the white tablecloths, the gleaming silverware. This was clearly a world she'd never experienced before. She sat on the edge of her seat, afraid to touch anything, like she might break something precious. "It's okay, Emma," David said softly. "You can relax. Tell me about yourself. What grade are you in?" "Second grade," she said, her voice stronger now that warmth was returning to her body. "I like to read and draw. My teacher says I'm really good at math too." David smiled, remembering another little girl who loved to read, who drew pictures of butterflies and rainbows. "That's wonderful. What's your favorite book?" Emma's face lit up. "Charlotte's Web. I've read it 4 times. My mum bought it for me at a garage sale for 50 cents. She paused, then added quietly, "It's the only book I have." The waiter brought steaming mugs of hot chocolate topped with whipped cream, and Emma's eyes went wide with wonder. "Is this really for me?" "All yours, sweetheart." As Emma sipped the rich chocolate, David gently asked, "Can you tell me about your mom? What kind of work does she do?" Emma's expression grew serious. "She used to work at the diner on 5th Street, but they closed down 3 months ago. Now she cleans offices at night. Sometimes she has to work really late, and I have to wait outside because she can't afford a babysitter." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "We lost our apartment last week. We've been staying in shelters, but tonight they were full." David felt his heart break a little more with each word. This child, this beautiful, innocent child, was homeless, alone, afraid, and trying so hard to be brave about it. "What about your dad?" he asked gently. Emma shrugged. "Never met him. Mom says he left before I was born. She says it's okay, though. Because we have each other." The strength in this 7-year-old's voice, the way she spoke about hardship with such matter-of-fact acceptance, reminded David powerfully of his own daughter. Alice would have been 22 now, if she'd lived, if that drunk driver hadn't stolen her from him 15 years ago. "Emma," David said, leaning forward, "what if I told you I might be able to help your mum find a good job? Would you like that?" Emma's eyes filled with hope, but then she looked down. "Mom says we can't take charity. She says we have to earn everything." "It wouldn't be charity," David assured her. "It would be a job with good pay for honest work." "Your mom sounds like a proud woman. I respect that." Just then, Emma's thin frame was racked with a violent coughing fit that left her gasping. David's concern deepened as he realized this wasn't just cold. This child was sick, very sick. "Emma, honey, how long have you been coughing like that?" Emma wiped her mouth with the cloth napkin, leaving small flecks of blood that made David's stomach clench with fear. "Just a few days," she said weakly, but her voice was getting hoarse. "Mom says it's just a cold." David knew better. He'd seen enough in his 52 years to recognize something serious when he saw it. This child needed medical attention, and she needed it tonight. But first, he had to find her mother. "Emma, can you remember where your mom is working tonight? Which building?" "The Hartman office tower," she said between coughs. "She cleans the 20th floor, but she won't be done until morning." David knew the building well. He'd had meetings there many times. He also knew that the night cleaning staff was often exploited, working for minimal wages with no benefits. The thought of Emma's mother scrubbing floors while her daughter sat freezing on the street made his jaw tighten with anger. "Okay, sweetheart, we're going to go see your mom right now. But she's working. It's okay. I promise she won't get in trouble." 20 minutes later, they stood in the gleaming lobby of the Hartman building. David's reputation opened doors that would have remained closed to others, and soon they were riding the elevator to the 20th floor. Emma had grown quieter during the ride, her coughing worse, and David could feel her small body trembling again, this time not from cold, but from fever. They found Sarah Carter in a corner office, on her hands and knees scrubbing baseboards with a determination that spoke of desperation. At 28, she was beautiful despite the exhaustion etched into her features, despite the cheap cleaning uniform that hung loose on her thin frame. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and her hands were red and raw from the harsh cleaning chemicals. "Mom!" Emma called out weakly. Sarah looked up, and the emotions that crossed her face in rapid succession, relief, fear, confusion, embarrassment, told David everything he needed to know about this woman's character. She scrambled to her feet, rushing to Emma. "Baby, what are you doing here? I told you to wait." Her eyes fell on David, taking in his expensive suit, his confident bearing. "Who are you? What do you want with my daughter?" "Mrs. Carter, my name is David Mitchell. I found Emma outside Santori's restaurant about an hour ago. She was freezing, and I was worried about her." Sarah's face flushed with shame and anger. "You had no right to take my daughter anywhere without my permission. Emma, come here right now." But as Emma moved toward her mother, Another violent coughing fit seized her, and this time the blood that came up was impossible to miss. Sarah's anger instantly transformed into terror. "Oh, God, Emma. Baby, when did this start?" "Mom, I'm okay," Emma whispered, but she swayed on her feet. David stepped forward. "Mrs. Carter, your daughter needs to see a doctor immediately." "This isn't just a cold." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "I know that," she said fiercely. "Do you think I don't know my own daughter is sick? Do you think I haven't been worried sick about her?" Her voice broke. "I don't have insurance. The free clinic is booked for 2 weeks. I'm doing everything I can." The raw pain in this mother's voice. The desperate love, the crushing weight of impossible choices. David felt it all hit him like a physical blow. This was what poverty really looked like. Not statistics or news stories, but a mother watching her child suffer and being powerless to help. "Let me help," David said quietly. "Please. Let me take Emma to Children's Memorial Hospital right now. The best doctors, the best care, no questions asked." Sarah stared at him, suspicion and desperation warring in her eyes. "Why? Why would you help us? What do you want?" David looked into Sarah Carter's eyes and saw every protective instinct a mother could possess. She was scared, exhausted, and proud. A dangerous combination that he'd have to navigate carefully. He understood her suspicion. In her world, nothing came free, especially not from men in $1,000 suits. "I don't want anything," David said simply. "Sometimes people just need help. And your daughter." He paused, watching Emma lean heavily against her mother, her breathing shallow and labored. "She reminds me of someone very important to me." Sarah studied his face, looking for deception, for the catch that had to be coming. "I can't pay you back. I don't have anything to offer you. I'm not asking for payment." People like you don't just help people like us," Sarah said bitterly. "There's always a price." David felt the familiar ache in his chest, the one that came whenever he thought about Alice. "Mrs. Carter, 15 years ago, I had a daughter. She was 6 years old with brown hair just like Emma's. She loved to read, loved to draw pictures of flowers." His voice grew quiet. "A drunk driver took her from me on a Tuesday afternoon. She was walking home from school." Sarah's expression softened slightly, but her guard remained up. "I would have given anything, everything I owned, for someone to help her that day, for someone to save her." David's eyes met Sarah's. "I can't save my daughter, but maybe I can help yours." Emma coughed again, the sound wet and painful, and Sarah's resolve cracked just a little. "I don't take charity. It's not charity. It's one parent helping another." David pulled out his phone. "I'm calling my driver. We can be at the hospital in 10 minutes. "Mom," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't feel good." Sarah's protective walls crumbled as she looked at her daughter's pale face, saw the fever burning in her eyes. Every instinct screamed not to trust this stranger, but every maternal fiber in her being screamed louder that Emma needed help. If we do this," Sarah said slowly, "it's a loan, every penny. I'll pay you back even if it takes the rest of my life." David nodded solemnly. "Whatever makes you comfortable." 30 minutes later, they sat in the pristine waiting room of Children's Memorial Hospital. Emma had been taken back immediately. David's name carried weight even here, ensuring that she received immediate attention from the best pediatric specialists in Chicago. The initial tests were already underway. Sarah sat rigidly in her chair, still wearing her cleaning uniform, still smelling faintly of disinfectant. She looked completely out of place among the marble floors and expensive artwork, and David could see how much this bothered her. "She's going to be okay," David said gently. "You don't know that." Sarah's voice was flat, emotionless. "You don't know anything about us." "You're right, I don't. But I know you love her. I can see it in everything you do." Sarah turned to look at him, really look at him for the first time. "Why did you really help us tonight? And don't give me that story about your daughter. There has to be more." David was quiet for a long moment. "Maybe there is. Maybe I'm tired of living in a world where little girls freeze on the street while I eat in warm restaurants. Maybe I'm tired of pretending that my money means anything if I can't use it to help someone who really needs it. Or maybe you feel guilty about something. The accuracy of her statement hit David like a slap. She was perceptive, this young mother. Too perceptive. Dr. Morrison, a nurse, appeared in the doorway. We have Emma's preliminary results. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison's face was serious as she approached them in the waiting room, her expression the kind that every parent dreads seeing. Sarah shot to her feet immediately, her hands trembling, while David stood more slowly, his business instincts already preparing for the worst. Mrs. Carter, I'm Dr. Morrison, the head of pediatric pulmonology. We've completed Emma's initial tests, and I need to discuss the results with you. How bad is it? Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. Emma has developed pneumonia, which has progressed significantly. Her left lung shows substantial inflammation, and her oxygen levels are concerning. However, Dr. Morrison's expression softened slightly. We caught it in time. With aggressive treatment, she should make a full recovery. Sarah's knees nearly buckled with relief, and David instinctively reached out to steady her. She didn't pull away. What kind of treatment? David asked. She'll need to be admitted for at least a week, possibly longer. IV antibiotics, oxygen therapy, and constant monitoring without treatment. Dr. Morrison didn't need to finish that sentence. Do whatever she needs, David said firmly. Whatever it costs. Dr. Morrison nodded. We'll get her started on treatment immediately. She's asking for her mother. As Sarah hurried away with the doctor, David sank back into his chair, feeling the weight of what had almost happened. If he hadn't found Emma tonight, if she'd spent another night on the street in her condition, he pushed the thought away. An hour later, Sarah returned, her eyes red from crying, but her face showing the first signs of hope David had seen all evening. She's sleeping, Sarah said, sitting down heavily. They've got her on oxygen and antibiotics. Dr. Morrison says the next 48 hours are critical, but she's optimistic. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the late-night activity of the hospital around them. Finally, Sarah spoke. I need to know why you're really doing this. Not the story about your daughter, though I'm sorry for your loss. I need to know what you expect from us. David considered his words carefully. 3 months ago, my mother was diagnosed with early-stage dementia. She's 78, and she's been the strongest woman I've ever known. Raised me alone after my father died, when I was 12. Worked 3 jobs to put me through college. Sarah listened intently. Last week, she told me something that's been haunting me. She said that despite all my success, all my money, she was worried I'd forgotten how to be human. That I'd built walls so high around my heart that I couldn't see the people who needed help right in front of me. And you think helping us proves something to your mother? Maybe. Or maybe I'm trying to prove something to myself. David looked directly at Sarah. When I saw Emma tonight, something in me broke open. Something that's been locked away since Alice died. I realized I'd been so focused on building my empire that I forgot why any of it mattered. And then Sarah studied his face in the harsh fluorescent light. You know this doesn't fix anything, right? Even if Emma gets better, we're still homeless. I still don't have a steady job. You can't solve all our problems with your checkbook. I know that, but maybe I can help solve some of them. How? David had been thinking about this since they'd arrived at the hospital. My company needs someone to manage our corporate headquarters. It's evening work, but it pays 3 times what you were making at the diner. Health insurance, dental, the works. The position comes with a small apartment in company housing. Sarah's eyes narrowed with suspicion. You're making this up. I'm not. I fired the last management company 2 weeks ago for cutting corners. I've been looking for someone who would actually care about doing the job right. And you think I'm qualified based on what? Watching me scrub baseboards? David smiled slightly. I think you're qualified based on how you've managed to raise a brilliant, kind, resilient daughter while dealing with circumstances that would break most people. That tells me everything I need to know about your character. The next morning brought weak December sunlight through the hospital windows, and with it, The news that Emma's condition had stabilized significantly during the night. David had stayed in the waiting room, dozing fitfully in the uncomfortable chairs, while Sarah had curled up on the small couch in Emma's room, unwilling to leave her daughter's side. Dr. Morrison found them both looking exhausted but relieved as she made her morning rounds. "Emma's responding beautifully to treatment," she announced with a genuine smile. "Her oxygen levels have improved dramatically, and the infection is already beginning to clear. She's asking for pancakes." Sarah laughed for the first time since David had met her, a sound that transformed her entire face. "That's my girl. She could eat pancakes for every meal if I let her." "She can have them," Dr. Morrison said. "Soft foods, plenty of fluids. Her appetite returning is an excellent sign." As the doctor left, David turned to Sarah. "I meant what I said last night about the job." Sarah had been thinking about his offer all night, weighing her pride against Emma's needs. "If I take this job, I want it understood that I earned it. Not because you feel sorry for us, not because of what happened to your daughter, because I can do the work." "Understood." "And I pay back every penny of Emma's medical bills. We work out a payment plan, but I pay it all back." David wanted to argue, but he recognized the steel in her voice. This was non-negotiable for her. "All right," Sarah took a deep breath. "Then yes, I'll take the job." Over the next hour, David made a series of phone calls that would change the Carter family's life forever. By lunchtime, Sarah had officially been hired as the new facilities manager for Mitchell Technologies' corporate headquarters. The position came with a salary that was more than she'd made in her best year at the diner, full health benefits, and a 2-bedroom apartment in the company's residential building. But as David was leaving the hospital that afternoon, Sarah called him back. "David," she used his first name for the first time, "I still don't understand why you're doing this. Really doing this." David paused at the elevator doors. For a moment, he considered telling her the complete truth about the daughter he'd lost, about the guilt he'd carried for 15 years, about how finding Emma had felt like getting a second chance at something he thought was gone forever. Instead, he said simply, "Sometimes the universe gives us exactly what we need, exactly when we need it. Maybe Emma needed to be found last night, and maybe I needed to find her." As the elevator doors closed, Sarah stood holding the business card he'd given her, with the address of their new apartment building. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to believe that maybe things were going to be okay. But neither of them knew that David's assistant, James Thompson, had been watching from the parking garage. Neither of them knew that James had already made 3 phone calls that morning, calls that would threaten to destroy everything David was trying to build, and neither of them knew that Margaret Mitchell, David's mother, had been asking very specific questions about where her son had spent the previous evening and why his clothes had smelled like disinfectant when he'd finally come home. The story was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. 2 weeks had passed since Emma's recovery, and the Carter family was beginning to settle into their new life at Mitchell Technologies' residential building. Sarah's apartment on the 15th floor was modest but clean, with large windows that overlooked downtown Chicago and a small bedroom that Emma had decorated with drawings of butterflies and rainbows. For the first time in months, they had stability, warmth, and hope. Sarah had thrown herself into her new role as facilities manager with the dedication David had expected. She arrived each evening at 6 o'clock sharp, methodically inspecting every floor of the 40-story building, coordinating with security, managing the cleaning staff, and ensuring that everything met the exacting standards of Mitchell Technologies. The other employees had initially been skeptical of the new manager, but Sarah's attention to detail and genuine care for the building had quickly won them over. David found himself looking forward to their brief encounters each evening when he worked late. Sometimes he would find Sarah in the break room, reviewing maintenance schedules over a cup of coffee, her blonde hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, her face serious with concentration. Other times, he would see her in the lobby, discussing security protocols with the night guards, her voice carrying the quiet authority that came from someone who had learned to survive on her own terms. But it was Emma who had truly captured his heart. The little girl had recovered completely from her pneumonia, and her natural curiosity and intelligence shone brighter each day. She would often come to the building after school, doing her homework in the small office David had set up for Sarah, or reading in the corner while her mother worked. David had started bringing her books from his personal library, watching with delight as she devoured stories about adventures and magic. Tonight was different, though. David could sense tension in the building as soon as he stepped off the elevator on the 38th floor. His assistant, James Thompson, was waiting in his office with a stack of papers and an expression that David had learned to dread. "We need to talk," James said without preamble. At 35, James had been with Mitchell Technologies for 8 years, working his way up from junior analyst to David's right-hand man. He was brilliant, ambitious, and completely ruthless when it came to protecting the company's interests. "It's about the Carter situation." David set down his briefcase and poured himself a scotch from the crystal decanter on his desk. "What about it?" "People are talking, David. Board members, investors, competitors. Word has gotten out that you personally intervened to help an employee and her daughter. Some are calling it admirable, others—" James paused dramatically. "Others are questioning your judgment. My judgment in helping a sick child. Your judgment in getting emotionally involved with employees. Your judgment in making decisions based on sentiment rather than business logic." James spread the papers across David's desk. "I've compiled a report on the financial implications of your actions. The hospital bills, the apartment, the salary increase for a position that doesn't technically require that level of compensation. It's adding up." David glanced at the numbers but didn't really see them. "James, the company made $3 billion in profit last year. What I spent helping the Carters wouldn't even register as a rounding error. It's not about the money, and you know it. It's about perception. It's about the precedent you're setting." James leaned forward. "What happens when every employee with a sob story comes knocking on your door? What happens when the board decides you're too emotionally compromised to make tough decisions?" David studied his assistant's face, recognizing the calculated concern, the carefully modulated worry. James had always been protective of David's interests, but lately his protectiveness had taken on an edge that made David uncomfortable. "Are you questioning my ability to run this company, James?" "Of course not. I'm questioning whether you're thinking clearly about this particular situation." James stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights below. "I've done some research on Sarah Carter. Did you know she was married before? Her ex-husband, Mark Carter, left when Emma was 2 years old. He owed child support that he never paid. What if he comes back now that Sarah has a good job? What if this situation becomes more complicated than you anticipated?" David felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December wind rattling the windows. "How do you know about her ex-husband?" "I had a background check run, standard procedure for all new employees in sensitive positions." I never authorized a background check on Sarah Carter." James turned back to face David, his expression carefully neutral. "I took the liberty of ordering one, for the company's protection, and yours." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken implications. David realized that James had been working behind the scenes, investigating the Carters, possibly undermining the trust that David had been building with Sarah and Emma. The thought filled him with anger, but also with something else. Fear. Fear that James might be right about the complications that could arise. "James, I want you to understand something very clearly," David said slowly. "The Carter family is under my personal protection. Any attempts to interfere with them, to investigate them, or to use their past against them will be met with immediate termination. Is that understood?" James nodded, but David could see the calculation in his eyes. "Of course, I was only trying to protect you." After James left, David sat alone in his office, staring out at the city where Emma and Sarah were probably settling in for the night, safe and warm in their new home. He thought about Alice, about the daughter he'd lost, about the second chance he'd been given to help a child who needed him. But James's words echoed in his mind, raising doubts and fears that he'd been trying to ignore. What if Sarah's ex-husband did come back? What if there were complications that David hadn't anticipated? What if his desire to help was actually putting Emma and Sarah in more danger? His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. The caller ID showed his mother's number. "David, dear, how are you feeling? You've seemed different lately, happier somehow." Margaret Mitchell's voice carried the warmth and perception that had guided David through every major decision of his life. At 78, despite her early-stage dementia, she remained one of the most insightful people he knew. "I'm fine, Mother, just busy with work." "No, don't lie to your mother, David. I may be getting forgetful, but I'm not blind. You've been humming in the mornings. You haven't done that since Alice was alive." David smiled despite his concerns. "There's a little girl, Mother. Her name is Emma. She's 7 years old and she's—" He paused, searching for the right words. "She's brought something back to life in me that I thought was gone forever. Tell me about her." And David did. He told his mother about finding Emma in the snow, about her courage and intelligence, about Sarah's fierce pride and determination. He told her about the books Emma loved to read, about the way she drew pictures of butterflies, about how her laughter reminded him of Alice. When he finished, Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "David, this child and her mother, they're not replacements for what you lost. You understand that, don't you?" "Of course I do. But they might be exactly what you need to find your way back to being the man I raised you to be. The man who cares more about doing right than being right." After he hung up, David made a decision. Tomorrow he would have a conversation with Sarah, a real conversation about their future, about his intentions, about the complications that might arise. He owed her honesty, and he owed Emma the protection that came with full knowledge of the situation they were all walking into. But tonight he would simply be grateful for the second chance he'd been given, and the family that had unexpectedly become the most important thing in his world. The conversation David had been planning with Sarah came sooner than expected, but not in the way he'd anticipated. The next evening, as he was leaving his office, he heard raised voices coming from the building's lobby. His heart sank as he recognized Sarah's voice, tight with anger and fear, and a man's voice that he didn't recognize, loud, aggressive, and clearly drunk. David hurried to the elevator, his mind racing with possibilities, none of them good. When the doors opened on the lobby level, he saw Sarah standing protectively in front of Emma, facing a man who was obviously Mark Carter, her ex-husband. Mark was tall and thin, with the kind of dangerous energy that came from desperation and alcohol. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair unkempt, and his eyes held the wild look of someone who had nothing left to lose. "I said I want to see my daughter," Mark was saying, his voice echoing off the marble walls of the lobby. "You can't keep her from me, Sarah. I have rights." "You have no rights," Sarah replied fiercely. "You walked out on us 5 years ago. You never paid a penny of child support. You have no claim on Emma." Emma clung to her mother's coat, her eyes wide with fear. She was too young to fully understand the situation, but she could sense the danger radiating from this stranger who claimed to be her father. David approached slowly, his businessman's instincts kicking in. This was a delicate situation that could explode in any direction, and Emma's safety was his primary concern. "Is there a problem here?" David asked calmly, positioning himself slightly between Mark and the Carter women. Mark turned to study David, taking in the expensive suit, the confident bearing, the obvious wealth. "And who the hell are you?" "I'm David Mitchell. I own this building. And you are?" "Mark Carter, Sarah's husband, Emma's father. And I want to know what my wife and daughter are doing living in a place like this." Mark's eyes narrowed as understanding dawned. "Unless you're the reason they're here. Unless you're the sugar daddy who's been taking care of my family." Ugh. Sarah stepped forward, her face flushed with anger. "I'm not your wife anymore, Mark. We've been divorced for 3 years, and Emma doesn't even remember you." "Well, maybe it's time she got to know her old man." Mark said, reaching toward Emma. David moved quickly, intercepting Mark's hand before it could touch the little girl. "I think you should leave," he said quietly, but there was steel in his voice that made Mark step back. "You don't get to tell me what to do," Mark snarled. "This is between me and my family." "Actually, it's not." David pulled out his phone. "Sarah, Emma, why don't you go upstairs? I'll handle this." "I'm not leaving," Sarah said firmly. "This is my problem to deal with." "Mom, I'm scared," Emma whispered, and the sound of her frightened voice made David's protective instincts flare even stronger. "Sarah, please," David said gently, "take Emma upstairs. Give us a few minutes to talk this through like adults." Reluctantly, Sarah gathered Emma and headed toward the elevators. But not before giving Mark a look that could have frozen fire. "If you're not gone in 10 minutes, I'm calling the police." Once they were alone, David turned his full attention to Mark Carter. The man was clearly struggling with addiction, probably unemployed, and desperate enough to try extracting money from his ex-wife's good fortune. "What do you really want, Mark?" Mark's bravado faltered slightly under David's steady gaze. "I want my family back." "No, you don't. If you wanted your family, you wouldn't have left them homeless and struggling. You wouldn't have shown up here drunk, scaring your daughter. What you want is money." Mark's face twisted with anger and shame. "Maybe I made mistakes. Maybe I wasn't ready to be a father when Emma was born, but I've changed. I deserve a second chance." "Second chances are earned," David said. "What have you done to earn one?" "I've been clean for 6 months. I've got a job lined up in Denver. I can provide for them now." David could see the lies layered beneath the desperate truths. Yes, Mark probably had been clean for some period of time, but not 6 months, and the job in Denver was likely wishful thinking at best. "Even if that were true, Emma doesn't know you. Sarah has built a life here, a good life. What right do you have to disrupt that?" "I'm her father," Mark said, but the words lacked conviction. "Being a father is more than biology," David replied. "It's about being there when your child is sick. It's about reading bedtime stories and helping with homework. It's about putting your child's needs before your own wants. When have you ever done that?" Mark was quiet for a long moment, and David could see the man struggling with truths he didn't want to face. "Look, I know I screwed up, but I need money, just enough to get back on my feet, to prove I can be the man they need me to be." There it was, the real reason for Mark's sudden appearance. David had seen this scenario play out countless times in business, desperation dressed up as righteousness, greed masquerading as love. "How much?" David asked simply. "What? How much money would it take for you to disappear permanently, to sign away your parental rights and never contact Sarah or Emma again?" Mark's eyes lit up with the possibility of easy money, but he tried to maintain his facade of injured fatherhood. "I don't want money. I want my family." "That's unfortunate," David said, "because money is the only thing I'm offering, and the offer expires in 60 seconds. The calculation was obvious on Mark's face. Whatever amount he was imagining was probably more money than he'd seen in years. David waited patiently as greed battled with whatever paternal instincts Mark might actually possess. 50,000, Mark said finally. 10,000, cash, tonight. But you sign legal documents terminating your parental rights, and you leave Chicago immediately. If you ever contact Sarah or Emma again, if you ever come near them, the deal is void, and I'll have you arrested for harassment." Mark nodded eagerly, and David felt sick at how quickly the man had sold his own daughter. 2 hours later, Mark Carter was on a bus to Denver with $10,000 in cash and no legal claim to Emma whatsoever. David had called his lawyer, had the documents drawn up and signed, and had personally escorted Mark to the bus station. But when David returned to the building, he found Sarah waiting in the lobby, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "How much did you pay him?" she asked without preamble. David realized there was no point in lying. 10,000. Sarah nodded slowly. "I see. So you bought my daughter. Is that how this works in your world? Everything has a price." "Sarah, that's not what happened." "Isn't it?" My ex-husband shows up, threatens our new life, and you make him go away with money. Just like you made our problems go away with money. Just like you'll probably make us go away with money when we become inconvenient. David felt the unfairness of her accusation, but he also understood the fear behind it. I was protecting Emma. I was protecting you. I didn't ask you to protect us. I asked for a job, not a savior. Sarah's voice was calm, but David could see the hurt in her eyes. Emma's upstairs crying because the man who was supposed to be her father just proved that she's worth exactly $10,000 to him. How do I explain that to a 7-year-old? You tell her that she's worth everything to the people who really love her, David said quietly. Sarah studied his face for a long moment. And who are those people, David? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you just proved that everyone has a price. The accusation hit David like a physical blow, not because it was entirely unfair, but because it contained just enough truth to hurt. He had used money to solve the problem. The same way he solved every problem, and in doing so, he'd inadvertently reinforced every fear Sarah had about depending on someone like him. Sarah, I need some time to think, Sarah said, turning toward the elevators, about whether this job, this apartment, this whole situation is really what's best for Emma. As the elevator doors closed between them, David realized that in trying to protect the Carter family, he might have just lost them forever. David spent a sleepless night pacing his penthouse apartment, replaying every moment of the confrontation with Mark Carter and its aftermath. Sarah's words echoed in his mind. Everyone has a price. The accusation stung because it forced him to confront an uncomfortable truth about how he'd been handling the situation with Emma and Sarah. Despite his good intentions, he'd been approaching their relationship the same way he approached business deals, identifying problems and throwing money at them until they disappeared. The next morning, David arrived at work to find James Thompson waiting in his office with a satisfied expression and a fresh stack of papers. I heard about last night, James said without preamble. Mark Carter, the payoff, the whole mess. Frankly, I'm not surprised it came to this. How did you hear about it? David asked sharply. Building security reports to me, remember? I saw the incident report, the police inquiry, the late-night lawyer visit. James set down the papers. David, this is exactly what I was worried about. Getting involved with the Carters was bound to lead to complications. David poured himself coffee with hands that weren't entirely steady. The situation is handled. Mark Carter is gone permanently. For now, but what happens when Sarah decides she doesn't want to feel indebted to you anymore? What happens when she realizes that her benefactor solved her problem by essentially purchasing her ex-husband's parental rights? James leaned forward. She's going to start questioning everything, David. Your motives, your methods, your intentions regarding her daughter. David felt a chill of recognition. James was right about Sarah's likely reaction, and his accuracy was disturbing. I've prepared a severance package, James continued, sliding the papers across the desk. Generous enough to assuage any guilt you might feel, but structured to ensure a clean break. Sarah can find another job, another apartment. The Carter family can build their own life without feeling beholden to you. David stared at the papers without reading them. You want me to fire Sarah? Bidgie, I want you to recognize that this situation has become untenable. Sarah Carter is proud, David. She's not going to accept charity indefinitely, especially not after last night. Better to end things on good terms now than wait for it to explode in our faces. And Emma? James's expression softened slightly. Emma is a lovely child, and what you did for her was admirable. But she's not your daughter, David. She never can be. Continuing this relationship is only going to cause pain for everyone involved. David wanted to argue, but James's words contained an uncomfortable kernel of truth. The look in Sarah's eyes last night, the hurt and suspicion, suggested that she was already questioning the foundation of their relationship. Maybe James was right. Maybe the kindest thing would be to let them go. But the thought of losing Emma, of never again seeing her face light up when he brought her a new book, of never again hearing her laugh at his terrible jokes, felt like losing Alice all over again. I need to think about this, David said finally. Don't think too long, James warned. The longer you wait, the messier this becomes. That evening, David found himself walking through the building's residential floors, something he'd never done before meeting the Carters. He told himself he was just checking on the facilities, but he knew he was hoping for a glimpse of Emma, for some sign that their relationship could be salvaged. He found Sarah in the building's small library on the 12th floor, sitting alone among the shelves of books. She looked tired, older somehow, as if the events of the previous night had aged her beyond her 28 years. "May I sit?" David asked. Sarah nodded without looking up from the book in her lap. Charlotte's Web, he noticed, Emma's favorite. "How is she?" David asked. Confused. Hurt. She keeps asking why her daddy didn't want to stay and get to know her. Sarah's voice was quiet, controlled. "I told her that sometimes adults make choices that don't make sense, even to themselves." They sat in silence for several minutes, surrounded by the soft whisper of pages turning as other residents browsed the evening collection. "I've been thinking about what you said last night," David began carefully. "About everyone having a price. You're right, you know. That's exactly how I've been approaching this entire situation. Problem appears, throw money at it, problem disappears." Sarah finally looked at him. "It's not your fault. It's just who you are, who your world has made you." "But it doesn't have to be," David said. "Sarah, I want you to know that everything I've done, the job, the apartment, paying off Mark, none of it was about buying your gratitude or your daughter's affection. It was about trying to be the kind of man I used to be, before loss and success turned me into someone I don't always recognize." "I know," Sarah said softly. "And that's what makes this so hard." "What do you mean?" Sarah closed the book and turned to face him fully. "I mean that I can see who you really are underneath all that money and power. I can see the man who lost his daughter and never forgave himself for not being able to save her. I can see the man who found Emma and saw a second chance at redemption." She paused. "But I also see the danger in that." "What danger?" "The danger of Emma becoming your substitute daughter. The danger of me becoming grateful enough to overlook the fundamental inequality in our relationship. The danger of building something that feels real but is actually just an elaborate way for both of us to avoid dealing with our own pain." David felt as if Sarah had reached into his chest and exposed every fear he'd been trying to avoid. "So what do we do?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "I know that Emma adores you. I know that you've given us a life we never could have imagined. I know that walking away from all of this would probably be the hardest thing I've ever done." She stood up, clutching the book to her chest. "But I also know that staying means accepting that our entire relationship is built on your need to save us and our need to be saved. And I'm not sure that's fair to any of us, especially Emma." As Sarah walked away, David realized that this conversation had changed everything. The easy equilibrium they'd established, the comfortable roles of benefactor and grateful recipient, had been shattered. Now they had to decide whether they could build something real from the pieces, or whether some distances were too great to bridge. But neither of them knew that Margaret Mitchell had been having memory episodes all week, growing increasingly confused about where David was spending his evenings and why he seemed so preoccupied. And neither of them knew that Margaret had decided to take matters into her own hands, making a phone call that would bring all their carefully constructed arrangements crashing down around them. The call was to the one person Margaret trusted to help her understand what was happening to her son, Detective Robert Nash, David's oldest friend, who had been investigating a series of embezzlement cases at several major Chicago corporations. The same embezzlement cases that James Thompson had been very carefully monitoring for the past 6 months. Detective Robert Nash had known David Mitchell since they were 12 years old, growing up in the same working-class neighborhood on Chicago's South Side. While David had built a business empire, Robert had built a reputation as one of the city's most tenacious investigators. So when Margaret Mitchell called him with concerns about her son's recent behavior, Robert took the call seriously. "She's worried about David," Robert told his partner. Detective Maria Santos, as they sat in their downtown precinct office, says he's been acting strangely, spending time with a woman and child, being secretive about his activities. Sounds like he's having an affair, Maria observed, reviewing the case files spread across her desk. That's what I thought initially. But Margaret insists it's something else. She says David seems happy for the first time since his daughter died, but also anxious, like he's hiding something important. Maria looked up from her files. Wait, David Mitchell, as in Mitchell Technologies? The company that's been on our radar for the embezzlement investigation. Robert felt a chill of recognition. For the past 6 months, they'd been tracking a sophisticated financial crime ring that targeted major corporations, using inside information to siphon money through seemingly legitimate transactions. Mitchell Technologies had appeared on their list of potential targets, but they'd found no evidence of actual theft. What kind of connection are you thinking? Robert asked. Maria pulled out a thick folder. We've been monitoring unusual financial activities at several companies. Large cash withdrawals, payments to shell companies, sudden changes in accounting procedures. Mitchell Technologies showed some irregularities, but nothing we could pin down. She paused. But if David Mitchell is involved with someone who has access to his financial information, you're suggesting Sarah Carter might be involved in the embezzlement scheme. I'm suggesting we need to look deeper into this whole situation. A woman and child appear in a wealthy CEO's life right around the time his company starts showing financial irregularities. That's not a coincidence. Robert's loyalty to David warred with his investigative instincts. Let's see what we can find before we jump to conclusions. Meanwhile, across town, David was in his office working late when James Thompson appeared with yet another stack of documents and an expression of barely controlled excitement. David, we have a problem. A serious problem, James announced, closing the office door behind him. What now? I've been monitoring our financial systems, like always, and I've discovered some concerning irregularities. Money has been moved around, accounts have been accessed, procedures have been bypassed. James spread the documents across David's desk. Someone with high-level access has been systematically stealing from the company. David felt his stomach drop. How much? Nearly $2 million over the past 6 months. Small amounts at first, gradually increasing. Whoever did this was very careful, very clever. James paused dramatically. And they had inside knowledge of our security protocols. Who had access to these accounts? That's the problem, David. The access codes used belong to you. Someone either hacked your personal credentials or someone you trust betrayed that trust. David studied the financial records, his mind racing. The theft had indeed been sophisticated, using legitimate-looking transactions that would be difficult to trace. But something about James's presentation bothered him. The timing, the dramatic reveal, the convenient discovery, just as his relationship with Sarah was becoming complicated. When did you discover this? This afternoon. I've been working all evening to trace the transactions. James leaned forward. David, I need to ask you something, and please don't take this the wrong way. Have you shared your access codes with anyone? Sarah Carter, perhaps, given her access to company systems for her facilities management role. The implication hit David like a physical blow. You're suggesting Sarah stole from the company? I'm suggesting that the timing is suspicious. She appears in your life, gains your trust, receives access to the building and company systems, and suddenly money starts disappearing. James's voice carried false reluctance. I know you care about her and Emma, but David, we have to consider the possibility that this entire relationship was orchestrated. David wanted to reject the suggestion immediately, but doubt crept in, despite his best efforts. Sarah had been desperate when he found her, homeless and struggling. Would desperation drive someone to elaborate deception? Could her entire story, Emma's illness, even Mark Carter's appearance, all be part of a sophisticated con? There's more, James continued. I did some additional research on Sarah Carter's background, her previous employer. Morrison's diner closed not because of financial difficulties, but because the owner discovered money missing from the till. Sarah was the night manager. She left before any formal investigation could be completed. David felt the world shifting beneath his feet. Every interaction with Sarah, every moment of connection he'd felt, suddenly seemed suspect. Had he been played by someone skilled enough to exploit his grief and loneliness? "What do you recommend?" David asked quietly. "We need to involve the authorities, report the theft, provide evidence of the security breaches, let the police investigate properly." James gathered the documents. "And David, you need to distance yourself from the Carter family immediately. If this goes to trial, any continued association with them will compromise your position." David nodded numbly. Everything he'd built with Sarah and Emma, the trust, the affection, the sense of family he'd rediscovered, all of it felt contaminated by suspicion and doubt. But James Thompson's satisfaction was short-lived. As he left David's office with promises to handle the police report, he didn't notice Detective Robert Nash in the building's lobby, conducting what appeared to be a routine security consultation with the night guards. Robert had spent the afternoon investigating Sarah Carter's background, and what he'd found didn't match James Thompson's narrative at all. Morrison's diner had indeed closed, but due to the owner's gambling debts, not employee theft. Sarah had left because the diner couldn't pay her wages, not because she was under investigation. More importantly, Robert's financial crimes unit had been tracking the real embezzlement ring for months, and they had a prime suspect, a network of corporate assistants and accountants who used their trusted positions to manipulate financial records. James Thompson's name had appeared on their watch list 3 weeks ago, after unusual patterns emerged in his personal banking records. As Robert watched James leave the building, he realized that David's assistant was likely using the Carter family as scapegoats for his own crimes. The question was whether David was an innocent victim or a willing participant in the deception. Robert pulled out his phone to call his partner. They needed to move fast before James could complete whatever endgame he was planning, but they also needed to be careful. David Mitchell was his oldest friend, but if David was involved in the embezzlement, friendship wouldn't protect him from justice. The net was closing around someone, but Robert wasn't yet sure who would be caught when it finally tightened. The next morning brought chaos that would forever change the lives of everyone involved. David arrived at Mitchell Technologies to find the building surrounded by police cars, federal agents, and news vans. Detective Robert Nash met him at the entrance with an expression that mixed professional duty with personal regret. "David, I need you to come with me," Robert said quietly. "We have some serious questions to ask you. What's happening? What's this about?" "It's about $2 million missing from your company accounts and evidence suggesting you may have been involved." David felt the world tilt around him. "Robert, you know me. You know I would never—" "I know what I want to believe, David, but I also know what the evidence suggests." Robert guided him through the crowd of reporters and investigators. "James Thompson contacted us late last night, provided financial records showing systematic theft from Mitchell Technologies. He claims you've been acting strangely, making unusual financial decisions, possibly compromised by a personal relationship." As they entered the building, David saw Sarah in the lobby, flanked by 2 federal agents, her face pale with shock and confusion. Their eyes met across the marble expanse, and David saw the moment when doubt replaced trust in her expression. She'd heard enough of the accusations to understand that she was being implicated in a crime she didn't commit. "Sarah," David called out, but the agents moved her toward a different elevator, taking her away for questioning. For the next 6 hours, David sat in a sterile interrogation room, answering questions about his financial practices, his relationship with Sarah Carter, and his knowledge of the missing money. The evidence against him was circumstantial but damaging. Access codes linked to his account, financial transfers authorized with his digital signature, and James Thompson's testimony about David's recent erratic behavior. Your assistant says you've been emotionally compromised, Detective Santos explained. He suggests that Sarah Carter manipulated you into providing access to company accounts, possibly without your conscious knowledge. That's impossible. Sarah works as facilities manager. She doesn't have access to financial systems. No, but you could have given her access. The codes used in these transactions belong to you, Mr. Mitchell. David realized he was trapped in an impossible situation. Denying involvement made him look guilty. Admitting to sharing access codes to help Sarah would make him appear incompetent at best, complicit at worst. Meanwhile, 3 floors up, Sarah was facing her own interrogation. The agents showed her bank records, transaction logs, and security footage that painted a picture of systematic theft executed through her access to the building and David's trust. Ms. Carter, your financial situation improved dramatically 6 weeks ago, Agent Williams pointed out. New job, new apartment, expensive medical care for your daughter. Where did the money really come from? Mr. Mitchell helped us. He offered me a legitimate job, a job that conveniently provided access to the building where these thefts occurred, a job that required unusual trust from a man who had never shown such personal interest in employees before. It wasn't like that. David found Emma when she was sick. He helped us because he's a good man. Agent Williams consulted her notes. Emma, your 7-year-old daughter, the daughter you claimed was homeless and dying of pneumonia, the daughter who happened to capture the sympathy of one of Chicago's wealthiest men. The implication was clear, and Sarah felt sick as she understood how their genuine story was being twisted into evidence of elaborate manipulation. We have witness testimony suggesting that your ex-husband's appearance was staged, Agent Williams continued, that the $10,000 payment was actually a cover for much larger financial transactions. Mark is Emma's real father. David paid him to leave us alone, to terminate his parental rights. That was David protecting Emma, not some criminal conspiracy. But even as Sarah said the words, she could hear how they sounded to outside ears. A convenient story that justified cash payments and explained away suspicious behavior. Hours passed. The interrogations continued. David and Sarah were kept separate, unable to coordinate their stories or support each other. James Thompson was interviewed as a key witness, expressing convincing concern for his employer while providing testimony that implicated both David and Sarah in the theft scheme. It wasn't until late afternoon that Detective Nash's Financial Crimes Unit uncovered the evidence that changed everything. Robert, you need to see this, Detective Santos called from her computer terminal. I've been digging deeper into James Thompson's background, and I found something interesting. Yeah, Robert reviewed the financial records Santos had discovered. For the past year, James Thompson had been making deposits to offshore accounts that exactly matched the timing and amounts of the alleged thefts from Mitchell Technologies. It gets better, Santos continued. Thompson's been in contact with a network of corporate embezzlers we've been tracking for months. He's been feeding them information about wealthy executives, helping them identify targets for manipulation and theft. Robert felt pieces clicking into place. So, Thompson identifies David as a target, learns about his daughter's death and his emotional vulnerability, then orchestrates the entire situation with the Carter family. Not exactly. I think the Carter family is legitimate. They really were homeless. Emma really was sick, and David really did help them out of genuine kindness. Santos pulled up more records. But Thompson saw an opportunity to use David's emotional involvement as cover for his own crimes, pin the theft on David's compromised judgment, implicate Sarah as the manipulator, and walk away clean while his real accomplices disappear with the money. Robert realized that his oldest friend had been set up by someone he trusted completely, someone who had systematically destroyed David's reputation while stealing his money. But proving James Thompson's guilt would require careful coordination and precise timing. We need to move fast, Robert told Santos. "If Thompson realizes we're onto him, he'll disappear, and David and Sarah will take the fall for crimes they didn't commit." As the sun set over Chicago, three separate plans were reaching their climax. James Thompson's scheme to frame David and Sarah for embezzlement, Robert Nash's investigation to expose the real criminal, and David's desperate attempt to protect the family he'd come to love. But none of them knew that Emma Carter, frightened and confused by the day's events, had slipped away from the social worker assigned to watch her and was now wandering through the city, looking for the man who had promised to keep her safe. The man who might be going to prison for crimes he didn't commit. Emma Carter had never been in downtown Chicago alone at night, but fear for David drove her small legs through streets she barely recognized. At 7 years old, she understood more than the adults realized. She knew that David was in trouble, that people were saying he and her mother had done something bad, and that the police might take him away forever. The December wind cut through her pink jacket as she made her way toward the Mitchell Technologies building, following a route she remembered from the car rides with David. She didn't understand the legal complexities of embezzlement or fraud, but she understood loyalty, love, and the desperate need to help someone who had saved her life. Meanwhile, Detective Robert Nash was coordinating the most delicate operation of his career. His team had finally gathered enough evidence to prove James Thompson's guilt, but they needed to catch him in the act of accessing the stolen funds. The plan was risky. They would confront James while he was attempting to transfer the final batch of money to his offshore accounts, hoping to record a confession that would exonerate David and Sarah. David and Sarah were being held in separate rooms at the police station, both unaware that their nightmare was about to end. David sat staring at the wall, thinking about Emma, wondering if he would ever see her again. Sarah was demanding to know where her daughter was, growing increasingly frantic as the social worker's evasive answers made it clear that Emma was missing. "Where is my daughter?" Sarah shouted for the 10th time. But the agents continued their questions, as if she hadn't spoken. At Mitchell Technologies, James Thompson was executing the final phase of his plan. He'd successfully transferred $1.8 million to accounts controlled by his criminal associates, leaving enough digital evidence to convict David and Sarah while providing himself with plausible deniability. Tonight, he would move the remaining money and disappear before anyone discovered the truth. James was so focused on his computer screen that he didn't notice Emma slip into the building through a service entrance her mother had shown her weeks earlier. The 7-year-old made her way to the executive floor, driven by a child's absolute certainty that she could somehow fix the terrible things happening to the people she loved. She found James in David's office, typing rapidly on multiple computers, moving numbers around on screens that made no sense to her young mind. But she recognized the intense concentration, the secretive behavior, the way James looked around nervously as he worked. "Mr. James," Emma said quietly from the doorway. James spun around, his face cycling through surprise, annoyance, and calculation. "Emma, what are you doing here? You shouldn't be in the building." "I'm looking for David. The police took him away, and Mommy too. Are you helping them?" James realized that this unexpected complication could actually work in his favor. If Emma Carter went missing while he was transferring the final funds, it would add another layer of chaos to the situation, making it even easier for him to slip away unnoticed. "Yes, sweetheart, I'm trying to help David and your mommy," James said with false warmth. "But I need you to come with me now. It's not safe for you to be here alone." Emma's natural trust warred with an instinct she didn't fully understand. Something about James's behavior reminded her of her father, Mark. The too bright smile, the careful words that didn't match the tension in his voice. "David told me to be careful around strangers," Emma said, backing toward the door. "But I'm not a stranger, Emma. I work with David every day. I'm his friend. Then why are you using his computer when he's not here?" The question, asked with a 7-year-old's directness, hit James like a physical blow. This child was too observant, too clever. He needed to control the situation before she said something that could expose him. James moved toward Emma, his false smile becoming more predatory. "Emma, I need you to come with me right now. We're going to go somewhere safe while I finish helping David." But Emma had spent 7 years learning to read adult deception, 7 years developing survival instincts that kept her safe in an uncertain world. She recognized danger when she saw it, and she ran. Emma's small size gave her advantages in the maze of offices and corridors. She knew hiding places her mother had shown her, service passages that adults overlooked. James pursued her through the building, growing increasingly desperate as he realized how thoroughly this child had disrupted his carefully laid plans. Emma found herself in the building's security office, where multiple monitors showed feeds from cameras throughout the building. Without fully understanding what she was doing, she pressed the red button her mother had shown her during their security tour, the button that activated emergency protocols and alerted the police. Within minutes, the building was flooded with officers responding to the security alert. Detective Nash and his team, who had been preparing to confront James in a controlled setting, suddenly found themselves in the middle of a crisis involving a missing child and a suspect who had nothing left to lose. James Thompson was cornered in the executive suite with $2 million in stolen funds and a 7-year-old witness who could destroy everything he'd worked for. In his desperation, he made the mistake that would finally expose him completely. He called his criminal associates for help, not realizing that the police had been monitoring those communications for months. "I need extraction now," James said into his phone, while Emma hid behind David's desk. "The situation is compromised. The girl knows too much." Detective Nash heard every word through the surveillance equipment his team had finally been able to activate. James Thompson had just confessed to crimes against David Mitchell and made threats against a child, crimes that would put him away for decades. The confrontation that followed was swift and decisive. James was arrested while attempting to flee the building with the stolen money. Emma was found safe but shaken, clutching a photograph of David and Alice that she'd taken from his desk. But the most important evidence came from Emma herself. When Detective Nash asked her what she'd seen, she provided a clear, detailed account of James using David's computer, moving money around, and acting guilty when she caught him. "He was scared when I asked why he was using David's computer," Emma told the detective. "David always says that scared people do bad things when they think they're going to get in trouble." 6 hours later, David and Sarah were released from custody with full apologies from the Chicago Police Department. James Thompson was in jail, facing federal embezzlement charges, and the money stolen from Mitchell Technologies was being recovered from offshore accounts. But the real reunion happened in the hospital, where Emma was being checked for exposure and exhaustion after her nighttime adventure. When David walked into her room, Emma launched herself into his arms with the force of 7 years' worth of love and trust. "I knew you didn't do anything bad," Emma said into his shoulder. "I knew you were just trying to help people, like you helped me and Mommy." Sarah watched from the doorway as David held her daughter, both of them crying with relief and joy. She realized that the events of the past 24 hours had stripped away all the complications, all the questions about money and charity and obligation. What remained was simple and true. They were a family, bound not by biology or debt, but by love freely given and received. 3 months later, on a warm March morning, David Mitchell and Sarah Carter were married in a small ceremony in Lincoln Park. Emma served as flower girl, carrying a bouquet of butterflies and rainbows that she'd drawn herself. Margaret Mitchell, whose memory had improved dramatically since David's happiness returned, served as matron of honor. The man who had built an empire from nothing discovered that the greatest wealth was the family he'd found when he wasn't looking for it, the daughter who had taught him that love multiplied when shared, and the woman who had shown him that true strength came not from having money, but from having people worth spending it on. And sometimes, On quiet Sunday mornings, when Emma was reading in the window seat of their new home, David would catch Sarah watching him with wonder, as if she still couldn't quite believe that fairy tales sometimes came true, even for people who had stopped believing in magic. "What are you thinking about?" he would ask. "Just remembering that night when you found us," Sarah would reply. "When you asked Emma if she wanted to have dinner with you. I thought you were just being kind to a homeless child. I never imagined you were offering us a home." And David would remember the moment when everything changed. When a 7-year-old girl shivering in the snow had looked up at him with eyes full of hope and trust, and had somehow saved them all.